Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a recommendation video of some of the most disturbing books I have ever read. This is a response to a previous video I did where I talked about the scariest books I had read, and unsurprisingly, you all loved it because it's become one of my most watched videos ever. And so if you haven't seen that, I'm going to have it linked in the cards and description box, but today I'm going to be talking about even more scary and disturbing books. And I've said before, I read a lot of horror, I read a lot of thrillers, so it takes a pretty special book to scare me. I do not need books to be scary to be fantastic. I love a lot of horror books that I don't find scary at all, but I do have a collection of mostly horror, but also some thrillers that scared the pants off of me, and hopefully they'll do the same thing to you. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. And in my opinion, this is easily one of the scariest horror books out there. I do recommend doing the audiobook because the experience with the author reading it along with a secondary voice for the young child creates a really terrifying experience. This, of course, is the classic story of a girl that is possibly possessed and her mother goes off to seek help because she is worried about her daughter. When the medical professionals leave her dry for answers, she reaches out to the church and possibly proceeds with an exorcism. Everyone knows the story. Even if you have watched the movie, I really encourage you to read the book because the original material is fantastic and it just creates a really good sense of foreboding as you're going through the story. And as you get towards the final scenes, as you get to spend more time with the young girl of Regan and you get to see her, how she is acting and what she is saying, it is so disturbing. So you have this little girl saying some of the most foul, vulgar things I have ever seen. There is a scene involving a crucifix, and especially for me, when the story is read to me and I hear all of these things out loud and they are performed, it is so messed up, and the voices they use and the images that come to my mind. Again, even if you have the movie already in your head, I really encourage you to give the book a try. I loved it, but yeah, it was a really terrifying experience. I've read this one multiple times, and I'd actually say that it gets scarier possibly with each read, which is not something you would normally say about a book. Next, I want to talk about The Changeling by Victor LaValle, and this follows a man named Apollo who at the beginning of the story gets married and has a child, and then something absolutely terrible happens and he is forced to go on a sort of adventure in order to try to save his family. And this is often described as fantasy horror because it very much leans into fairy tales. And I think for that reason, a lot of people would not consider this book very scary. A lot of people even question if it's truly horror, or is it just a dark fantasy book? But I will say that it is definitely horror by my opinion or my definition of the genre. And for me, it personally scared me a lot, which will probably surprise some of you. But I will admit that this is a very personal list, and I will say that what scares me won't necessarily scare other people. But since it's my list, I'm including it on here because there is one scene, and to be fair, I read it in the middle of the night. I was sleep deprived. My son was still young, so I had woken up and I checked on him, and I was reading the scene, for those of you that have read it, that involves the teapot. And that scene scared me so badly. And without giving away too much, what scares me about this book is that it deals with the fact that parents do not have complete control about what happens to their families, and that loss of control for me is absolutely terrifying. And this book really plays with that you can try to do all the right things, you can do your best, and sometimes it is not enough and things are outside of your control and bad things just happen. And for me, especially at the place I was at when I read it the first time, that was a truly terrifying concept. And so I remember laying in bed again, this time I was listening to the audio again and trying to fall back asleep while listening to this one scene about parenthood, and oh my goodness, I do not know how I ever fell back asleep because I thought it was so terrifying, so disturbing. I woke up in the worst mood. And especially if you are also a parent, especially with younger children, I do think that this book will really push some buttons and hopefully give you that same terrifying experience in a very personal way. So I'm going to put this one on the list, a little bit unconventional compared to some of the other disturbing books I'm going to talk about here, but for me, it was terrifying. Now, switching over to thrillers, I want to talk about Alex by Pierre Lemaitre. And this is a story that follows a young woman who is kidnapped and put inside a wooden cell, and her kidnapper says that he wants to watch her die. The story is also told from the perspective of an inspector, a police officer that is tracking her down and trying to save her life. And normally, I'll be honest, typically thrillers don't really scare me because I often find that they're written to be thrilling more so than terrifying. Again, just the fact that they're in that genre. But this one was both. It was such an exciting read. It was a page turner. I flew through it, but it had some absolutely disturbing scenes. In terms of a kidnapping story, I thought it was just disturbing to all the levels because you have this woman in this cage. She's so helpless, and the author does not shy away from the gruesome aspects of that. They are not shy to show how terrible her situation is. And if you have a phobia of rats, even if you do not have a phobia of rats, because I'm not particularly scared of rats, or so I thought until I read this book, this is one that will likely scare the crap out of you because those scenes involving the rats just made my skin crawl. So I cannot even imagine reading that if you have a true phobia of it. But regardless, this book has some really good twists and turns. But again, in terms of a story, it gets to some really dark places and really surprised me in the best possible ways. So I really encourage you all to check it out. In my opinion, perhaps a little bit more underhyped and well worth it if you want to just be terrified and creeped out. Switching gears again, I want to talk about Red X by David Demchuk, and this is a story set in the 1970s and so forth in the city of Toronto in Canada. We follow a time period that actually happened when a lot of young gay men disappeared out of the city, and for the most part, a lot of them were never found. And so the question is, what happened to them? The author takes this true event that was happening at the time and twists it into a horrifying horror story. So within this book, we follow a variety of men who disappear throughout the story. And this book is incredibly meta, which for me made this book an incredible piece of psychological horror, which often I think a lot of you will agree can be the most terrifying form of horror, especially when it comes to books. So within this story, it's told semi from the perspective of the author who puts himself within the story. And this book is great because it really blends together fact and fiction, and you're not quite sure where that line is when the two cross over. And so it gives this account of these young men, their disappearance, and so forth. And because this is a horror story, it's a question of, well, did they run away? Were they killed by a serial killer? Or was there something more supernatural going on? And this is a book that really got under my skin. And I think that, again, if you're someone who likes more subtle horror, a bit more intellectual, highbrow horror, that is going to make some really great commentary, but at the same time, it will not shy away from being a horror book because this one definitely creeped me out. So if you're looking for something that is going to not just scare you because there's a monster jumping out of the closet, but scare you because a lot of this really happened and a lot of this could happen, and it just leans into the possibilities of realistic horror, then I really think that you will enjoy this one. Again, it's one of my all-time favorites, and I love it because it's just a book that when you finish it, you won't stop thinking about it and you will want to read it again, and you should read it again because I liked it the first time, but I had to read it at least once more before I truly fell in love with it and appreciated everything the book was doing. But again, if you want a really smart psychological horror book that will just get under your skin and scare you in the most subtle way until suddenly you're just freaked out, this book, at least for me, had that fantastic experience, so highly recommend. Now, if we're going to talk disturbing books, I have to talk about In the Miso Soup, which is a book translated from Japanese where the story takes place. We follow a man who works as a tour guide, and in the story, he is touring around an American for 3 days and 3 nights. However, he is not the traditional tour guide. Instead, his job is to show people the dirty underbelly of the country, because while Japan has a reputation for being very polite and above board and very stoic, at least how the country and its people present themselves, there's actually this very dirty, dark underbelly to the culture, the subculture that exists. And so this book explores that. And so as you can imagine, each night they go off to different clubs and get to see some very dirty things taking place. So all the content warnings. But oh my goodness, this book gets messed up. You know that the American tourist is just not quite right. He's very unlikable. and you just know that the story is going to go to some horrible places. And when it goes there, oh, it goes there. I've got to say, some of the most disturbing scenes I have ever read. The author just clearly goes out of his way to make the reader as uncomfortable as possible. This book is not going to be for everyone, and I'll be honest, I don't think I actually enjoyed it. I did not give it a super high rating, but if you're looking for a book that will disturb you, I have to point you in this direction. You will be disturbed if you read this book. If you're not disturbed by those scenes, I'm more concerned about you as a reader, let me just say, because this book is messed up and the author pushes the limit in order to give the reader the most messed up reading experience possible. So if I haven't intrigued you with that, I don't know what else I can say, but definitely one you may want to check out for yourself or maybe steer clear from. Next, I want to talk about Tattered Demon by Steve Vernon, and this is a story that follows a wife who at the beginning of the story hits her husband with a frying pan and ends up killing him. She needs to get rid of the body, so she decides to bury him in a field. Little does she know that by doing so, she awakens a demon, because this is the same field where a witch was buried many years ago, and well, things that are dead do not always stay dead. And so the story follows her. This is a story that has some fantastic banter between the main character and the demon. It is very entertaining and a lot of fun, but it's also very disturbing. This book has huge content warnings for vulgar language, as well as the potential of sexual violence and other forms of violence. And while it definitely leans into some tropes of the potential harm to characters, particularly women, I did, for the most part, really enjoy this one. It is just disturbing in a way that I found really entertaining for the most part, and it was just a very dark tale. So if you haven't checked it out, if you're looking perhaps for something a little bit more underhyped, because I do recognize that some of the books I mentioned on this list are pretty popular. I think most people know about The Exorcist, and most people know it's supposed to be scary. So again, if you've already read those and are looking for something else to read, this is one that I hope I can put on your radar, and hopefully you will enjoy it and get as disturbed as I did. And finally, I want to talk about a book called Body Art by Christopher Terena. And this is a story told over a few different perspectives, one being a story following a couple of previous porn stars who back in their day were just celebrities in their own right. They're now getting a little bit older. And then we also follow a young couple that are trying to experiment and get pulled into a possible film. And then we also have the perspective of someone who likes to take apart bodies, and in doing so likes to reconstruct them into body art. I went to this book because I thought that the cover looked pretty cool. I got to read the updated cover. If I had seen the original cover, I probably would have had more of an idea what I was getting myself into. But I picked up this book on a whim without knowing too much about it, and well, I may have stumbled into some extreme horror. Admittedly, I don't read much of that subgenre, and it's pretty intense. So I've got to say, if you're looking for disturbing and extreme horror, there's a whole subgenre for it, so I can definitely point you in that direction. But if you're looking for a specific example, mine is here, Body Art, which I've got to say I was pretty impressed by. So I do need to start by giving all the content warnings for sexual explicit content, vulgar language, and all sorts of sexual violence and so forth, and a lot of body horror. There are definitely some scenes that made me very, very uncomfortable. I did this as a buddy read, and that was really awkward to discuss. And at the same time, I was really impressed by this book. I thought that the character work, given the scope of the story, was very well done. I appreciate the conversations about porn stars aging and the challenges of getting older in that industry. And this book was just very liberating and fun and entertaining, but oh my goodness, yeah, it goes to some dark places. But again, I would say if you're trying to try out extreme horror, I do think this is a pretty safe place to start, because while it is incredibly disturbing, messed up, and all of those things, I think that the subject matter was handled really well and appropriately, and honestly, I had a lot of fun reading it. So keep that in mind if you're looking to get into the subgenre. I think this is a pretty fun place to start. So that is it for this video here. I would love to hear of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out? And I'd also love to hear what is the most disturbing or messed up book or scariest book that you have ever read. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror thrillers as well as adult science fiction and fantasy. And if you are already subscribed, thank you so much. You can still help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, dropping a comment, even if it's just a scary emoji. And you can also hit that little notification bell so you never miss a video from me. Don't forget, if you missed my first video talking about my scariest books, I will have it linked in the description box and cards. Otherwise, I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.